just to put that out there for everybody. But let's go ahead and get started with our beautiful music. If you'll offer our prelude, then I'll come back with our opening words and chalice one. Come into the circle of love and justice. Come into this community of mercy, holiness, and health. Come, and you shall know peace and joy. For our chalice lighting today, I choose from our hymnal, Anonymous. May we be reminded here of our highest aspirations and inspired to bring our gifts of love and service to the altar of humanity. Our opening hymn is an oldie but goodie, a familiar one that will also lower our blood pressure, I think. Morning Has Broken, number 38. Please stand as you're able, or you choose to, and let's do our opening hymn. Response to our joys and concerns. If we can get Spirit of Life, and then when we get our slide, we'll get a note.
Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Thank you. Now I'm going to invite Maureen to come up and give us information about our social action recipient for this month, and then we'll take the offering after that with a little music from a video that I found that I think you might enjoy.
The social action recipient for October is the NAACP branch 707. That's our local branch. They're started the Alice Dar Art Scholarship. I want to tell you some bits about this scholarship. Like many, it requires standard eligibility requirements. It's restricted to residents of Allegheny County, graduates this year, 2025, and a GPA of 2.7. But it also requires that the recipient plans to enroll in the arts, has already been involved in activities and organizations revolving around the arts, And the application requires that performing artists submit a video of their performance and a short description of the piece. The visual artist must upload attachments of 3 works of theirs, and again, a description of the piece that they've created. All applicants have to submit an essay saying what drives your passion for art and how this scholarship would help you to pursue that passion. As honors director at Frostburg, I was on a lot of scholarship committees. And usually it was almost a formula. You looked at the GPA, they wrote an essay, and you said yes or no. And this really appealed to me in terms of the application process that they're going to use. It's in honor of Alice Regina Dar. I did not know anything about her, but she was a Cumberland native, African American, who had a fairly successful career in jazz performance, singing and piano playing. Her obituary is included on the NAACP's Facebook page, if you want to look at it. But that's about it. As always, donations today in the basket go to the scholarship, and I'm sure Chris would be happy to accept any checks you want to send. Just be sure to put in the memo October Social Action or the NAACP 707 scholarship. Thank you. Your generosity has always been amazing. I've heard that we collected $1,000 for the empowerment sleeping bags last month. And that's the highest we've ever collected for any given social action recipient.
Yeah, I think there's at least 2 kinds of people when you're at the table and you're experiencing scarcity. There's one group of people that starts limiting who can come to the table, and then there's the other people who just get a bigger table, right? And we're a bigger table kind of people. I hope we are. Okay, fun song, tough topic though. Anybody nervous about the election?
Yeah.
Now, see now, okay, it's going up now. That's all right. Now, I don't want to talk, I'm not talking about whether your preferred candidate may win or lose. That's kind of short term. It's in the immediate, so that's why it's pressing for us. But I'm more worried, and I wanted to focus on what's going to happen afterwards. And the fear of violence might be associated with the election and in the aftermath of that process. And I want to make, you know, it's a fine line I'm trying to walk here, because I don't want our services to be partisan, okay? They should not be partisan. I know that just because I actually know everybody, right? It's a good thing of a small congregation. You're all thinking, he's talking about those MAGA people, right? And, you know, that's kind of present for us, but I don't want us to be that partisan and that exclusive. What started this in part when I was doing the research on the election, and I knew that this was a topic for us to consider. And then when I realized in the poll about this, I put in the information earlier. This is a Pew poll from the spring. 28% of the Republicans agreed with the statement that we may have to resort to violence to get this country back on track again. But so did 18% of the independents and 13% of the Democrats. So it's not, it's just think bigger. Think bigger and think less partisan, okay? That's as much as I can say about it. I can't tell how you're going to receive that, what filter you have. But I've done my due diligence as a lawyer. Try to make this as bipartisan as we can. Okay, 2 weeks ago, I was teaching my students about the election of 1800. And that was the so-called Revolution of 1800. It was the first time power was peacefully transferred to an opposition party when Jefferson beat Adams. But a more interesting race actually occurred in 1824 when John Quincy Adams, John's son, ran against Andrew Jackson and 2 others. And in those days, candidates did not run with party labels. They weren't listed as Democrat or Federalist or Democrat, the names were just on the ballot. And Jackson won the plurality of both the popular and the electoral votes. He got more than anybody else, but he did not get a majority. And so it goes to the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams struck a deal with one of the other people who came in third and won the election in the House of Representatives without having won a plurality of the popular vote or the electoral vote. So Jackson was not happy with this result, but not a shot was fired, no protests. Jackson said, well, I'm going to get you the next time. And he did in 1828. Okay, so when we hear today, and we talk about January 6th being an exception, like this, we haven't had this in our history, those people are right. This is not part of our history. The violence that we've had and the violence that we're concerned that may occur, that seems to be in the air. So then the question is, where did we go wrong? I have an answer for you today. And I bet you're going to have some answers. This is going to be a good feedback session. You're going to be talking about this sermon on the way home, and you'll call it people to talk about that. It's bigger than any single event in trying to identify this, but as a case study, just to inform our thinking, I'm going to offer the case of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, in part because it's so close and we know we're kind of familiar with that. It certainly is an example of political violence. It took place 165 years ago this week on October 16th to 18th. And so that's one of the reasons it also stood out as timely for this time of year. The story of the raid starts at least several years before the first shots were fired. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened the federal role in returning escaped slaves from the North back to their enslavers. That's required in the Constitution, by the way, but there was no statute for the federal role until 1850, but it's in the Constitution. Many northern states refused to comply, which is not unlike the sanctuary cities that we see today in terms of the movements. There's a connection there. And one of the themes is to connect that's why I'm a history teacher. One is to connect these events with the past. How do they inform our thinking today? How is it like and not like what's happened in the past? Many Northerners now felt more complicit in the slave trade in much the same way people feel today about U.S. complicity in the war in Gaza. It's because our government is supplying the weapons, right? You see a connection there between the Fugitive Slave Act and the war in Gaza. Now, I want you to be able to pull these things together and see how this thread goes through our history and how is today like and then not like these events. But these things don't just happen out of the blue. Where we are today is not new, but completely new. But you get the idea. The Kansas-Nebraska, that was 1850. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed the territories to vote whether to come into the Union as free states or slave states. But it was upending an agreement, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that had drawn a line and said all these places in Kansas and Nebraska would come in as free states. They repealed that and said, oh, let's let people vote. Isn't democracy wonderful? Not in this case. All right, we'd had this compromise holding for 30 years. Now, Brown went there to Kansas, as did a whole ton of other people, to literally fight whether Kansas would come in as a free state and a slave state. It was the beginning of the Civil War. Because we're talking about militias, organized militias, fighting real battles, not just incidents of, bomb throwing battles or whatever, these were real battles, people lined up. And Brown went out there and led a group of folks. He was famous. He led a raid on Potawatomi Creek, which killed 5 civilians. Although I'm not sure what a civilian is in this context, enslavers. And that brought attention to him in the East Coast. So when he goes back home after spending some time there, he had this notoriety. He was already something of a celebrity. He's a big guy. He's dynamic. He's charismatic, and people were following him. Right? His goal was to free all the slaves by force if necessary. The first phase of that plan was to capture all the weapons being produced at Harper's Ferry, the arsenal, and then distribute them to the slaves in Virginia and Maryland and start a slave revolt. Okay. It did not go very far. Brown and his men barricaded themselves when they got there. The militia surrounded them. They barricaded themselves in the firehouse. The local militia held them in check there. It was a standoff. And then the U.S. Army showed up a day later, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, then, and one of his assistants, Lieutenants Jeb Stuart, okay, active in this area. After a brief firefight, 15 of Brown, he had 21 people with him, 15 of Brown's men were dead, and the rest, including Brown, were captured, tried for treason, and hanged. Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. They didn't take long to do things then. The raid was October 18th, and he was executed on December 2nd. He went from being a radical abolitionist to a martyr for a just and righteous cause. He was celebrated in song and poetry. Now, you remember the lyrics, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that's to the tune of John Brown's Body, which was a very popular camp song during the Civil War. People sang that. The battle hymn words that were added to that, or changed to that, by the way, were contributed by Julia Ward Howe, a very famous Unitarian. Now, put a bookmark there because that name's going to come up again. Not everyone approved of Brown's raid, and you can imagine people who had been big supporters of Brown before this saying, well, I've never seen the guy, right? You know, there's part of that going on. Right. And there's other parts, it's like, well, you know, I might not have gone that far, but, you know, he's wanted to do the right thing. I'm going to get, you know, I mean, there's people were really struggling to how to respond to that. Just as there are many people who believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, but then they don't want to say, I approve of the January 6th attack. Now, I didn't say I was for that. I just said that, right? You get that. These parallels are uncanny, in my humble opinion. All right. A side note, most Unitarians in the 1850s were emancipators and not abolitionists. Here's the difference. Abolitionists favored the immediate freedom of all enslaved persons. Emancipators favored the gradual emancipation of enslaved persons, often with payment to the enslaver for the loss of their so-called property, and over a period of years. Abraham Lincoln, not a Unitarian, fell into that camp until he fell out of it. This is what a lot of people did, right? As late as 1863, okay, in the middle of the war, he proposed an emancipation plan that would have taken 37 years before the last enslaved person would have been freed. A year later, he's going to be introducing the 13th Amendment and pushing that. Okay. But let's just talk about our ancestors in faith. It would be so easy to spend 20 minutes pointing our finger at the people we want to point our finger out. But I think it's more important in our services that we talk about us, not in a selfish way, but in a way that challenges us and gets us to think about our faith. Okay. Oh, another quick side note. Universalists were generally opposed to slavery. I don't have as much information. There's not as much research about them. Unitarians ran New England. And they were the government. the governor of Massachusetts, and they were all, and so there's much more information about the Unitarian response, right? And some of the more prominent writers, the transcendentalist writers, were all Unitarians. So we know a lot more about the Unitarians. We know less about the Universalists. So I'm not trying to diss half of our tradition. It's just, that's the way it is. As early as 1858, Brown met with the so-called Secret Six, that's how they became known, who provided him with $20,000 in today's dollars, $20,000, just to support him, to support his followers for food, for lodging, and also for weapons. They were buying up rifles and pipes. This included at least 4 Unitarians, 2 of whom were very prominent ministers, Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Theodore Parker, whom I quote at the end of every service. Okay. Another, Samuel Gridley Howe, who is the husband to the aforementioned Julia Ward Howe. Now, the group did include 1 Presbyterian. We'll let him off the hook. And then a transcendentalist, self-identified, which just means he was a Unitarian who never signed a membership book. So if you count him, 5 of the 6 were either Unitarians or Unitarian adjacent, as I like to call folks who identify with the tradition but may not fully sign the book. They're Unitarian adjacent. Now, historians are not sure how much they knew of what Brown was planning to do. And in 1858, when he was meeting and gathering funds and creating his little group, we're not sure, the historians are not sure even if Brown knew exactly what he was going to do, because at one point he had floated creating a guerrilla army that would just go and free slaves from here, place to place. And that's obviously, he changed in his direction there. And the Secret Six were never held accountable for their role in the raid. As I noted, it's not sure they even knew his plans. And when it happened, it kind of went under the radar. It's one of those, oh, well, of course I support abolition, and I think John Brown's a really courageous man, but I didn't know anything about this plan, right? That kind of stuff. And Theodore Parker happened to be traveling in Europe when that raid occurred, and then sadly, he died in Europe. He never did come back. He died in May of 1860. So it's important here to talk about context, especially we're going to ask how this raid might inform our understanding of those who believe violence may be necessary to restore America to its rightful place. I've given you a couple of examples of legislation. I talked about the Fugitive Slave Act and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What may be bigger than either of them was the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The raid's 1859. Just keep that as a benchmark. The Supreme Court declared that slaves were property. They could not have standing in a court of law to sue for any rights they may have. The government couldn't take slaves from people without paying the enslavers. That's the Fifth Amendment, the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. But that decision threatened to undermine even the states where slavery was banned. It threatened to overturn even state bans because, of course, the federal Constitution is going to trump any state ban on slavery. And but for the Civil War, that just never got played out in the courts because we know how long it can take to get the right case and to move forward. So it didn't. But a lot of Northerners woke up, including Abe Lincoln, after Dred Scott and said, our very own laws banning slavery are now at risk. We could have slavery everywhere. The chief executive at the time was President Buchanan, was wholly ineffective in slowing the spread of slavery or offering any hope of emancipation, let alone Brown. So Brown and those like-minded had good reason to believe that the government could no longer be trusted to do the right thing on the moral issue of the day that had so divided the nation. They could not trust the government. The guardrails had fallen, especially after that Supreme Court decision. You can make your own connections here. From the radical abolitionist perspective, the Congress, the presidency, the judiciary had been corrupted and dominated by the so-called Southern power, or in today's terms, white supremacy. Not a majority, but dominated the government. For them, it was only a small step from the conclusion in the Declaration to that conclusion to the Declaration of Independence, which I will remind you says that when a government fails to protect the rights of the people, it is the duty of the people to, quote, alter or abolish that government. Reactions to the raid were eerily similar to those of the January 6th insurrection. Many abolitionists expressed sympathy for the cause, but distanced themselves from Brown. William Lloyd Garrison, perhaps the most well-known abolitionist, the publisher of The Liberator, wrote in his newspaper that Brown's raid was a misguided, wild, and apparently insane effort. The guy's crazy. We believe in him, but he's crazy. Keep those parallels going. Ralph Waldo Emerson, though, was unrepentant in his support of Brown. Shortly before Brown's execution, he wrote, "John Brown will make the gallows glorious like the cross." And he's not even a Christian. Don't get me started. All right. For today, though, just again, I picked little snippets to use as case studies, because all you can do in 20 minutes. I want to focus on Thoreau. His is the most interesting because it was 10 years earlier in 1849 that he wrote the essay, Civil Disobedience. I mean, he literally wrote the book on how to disobey a government. And that inspired nonviolent resistance by both Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Both of them cited Thoreau. They studied Thoreau and were moved by what he wrote in that essay. In his essay, Thoreau denounced the government for its support of slavery, writing, "I cannot for an instant recognize the political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also." This is 1849. To protest the Mexican War, 46 to 48. That's the context in which he wrote that. To protest the Mexican War, many believed was fought just to add more slave states to the Union, which is probably true. There we go. He refused to pay his taxes, and that landed him in jail, but only for a night, because somebody paid the tax. Some say it was his mother, and some say it was Emerson himself who paid the tax for him. So as a martyr, he didn't sacrifice a whole lot. Okay, for the cause, but he did write about it. By the way, it's only 27 pages. I mean, you go reread Civil Disobedience. It's, you know, in fact, I look. You can get the complete works of Thoreau on Kindle for $2. Just everything. It's just that's worth $2. So I'll do that. All right. In any case, the proper way to disobey a government, according to Thoreau, was simply to not participate with the government. He discouraged people from voting. I mean, he said, all you're doing when you vote is you're just expressing your opinion. It's not doing anything. That's what he said anyway. Don't serve on juries. Don't seek elected office. He simply did not recognize the government of the United States. He viewed such participation as complicity with slavery itself. He felt it was his duty to right that wrong. Quoting, "If I have unjustly wrestled a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself." He answered the question, when is it appropriate to break the law? This way. If it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. That's a great line. I love that line. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. Still, though, his focus was on non-participation, not violence. He didn't even hunt. He's a vegetarian, by the way. Famous vegetarians: Thoreau, Emerson, Adolf Hitler. True. Just got to be careful with associations.
Yeah.
But he actually was a vegetarian. Was not a hunter. Just days before Brown's execution, this was at the end of October, Thoreau wrote a plea for Captain Brown, which is in his completed works, by the way. He read it to an audience in his hometown, Concord, Massachusetts. He compared Brown favorably to the patriots who founded our nation. He was like the best of those who stood at Concord Bridge once, on Lexington Common, and on Bunker Hill. See those parallels to the Revolution: alter or abolish. In his plea, Thoreau acknowledged Brown had openly endorsed violence to free the slaves, and then he wrote, and I agree with him, writing this: I think that for once, the Sharps, rifles, and the revolvers were employed in a righteous cause. And I take it from his phrase, for once, he was saying previous ones, they were not righteous. They were not the appropriate, but this one counts. This was a righteous cause. I'm right there with Brown all the way. So now, what do we do with this information? We don't claim to put people on pedestals, but let's be honest, we're pretty close with Emerson and Thoreau. We're quick to claim Emerson, Thoreau, and Parker as our ancestors in faith. You got Parker's picture hanging up back there, all right? They provided much of the intellectual foundation for our principles. They were the dissenters who became the majority, right? At one point, Emerson had been in UU ministry only for 2 years. He left Unitarian. He left the ministry with a dispute. He once referred to the cold corpse of Unitarianism. And because we'd become too much of an organized religion. We were fine until we became organized. And once we became an organized religion, Emerson said, you lost your way. But his stuff is now our foundational stuff. Now it's foundational. Now the question is, does this knock them down? What we know about their response to the raid, their approval of this violence, right? Does this knock them down a peg or two? Or does it lift them up in our esteem because of the circumstances and the cause? But more importantly, let's add this to our understanding of those who told the Pew Research poll that violence may be necessary to get this country back on the right track. Let's practice St. Francis now. Better seek first to understand than to be understood. I'm clearly not with those people, right? But I want to understand, where are they coming from? How do I relate to them, right? I have no trouble acknowledging that the wisdom of those whose character may or may not fall short of my values. So I am not throwing away my copies of Thoreau's work, or Emerson, or Harper. I may have to start adding more footnotes when we use some of his quotes. Like, this is the same guy who said this, right? That's fine. As for those who may threaten violence, before I judge them, I must first reflect on how I might respond if I believed the government was so corrupt and the institutions of government were so compromised and that the injustice was so great that the time had come, as it did with our nation's founders, to alter or abolish that government. What if I really believed that to be true? And what if there were actually some evidence for that? Some, right? I'm not there, but can I say that no reasonable person could be there? I think that's a harder question for me. Long term, the way back from this precipice is to restore confidence in our core institutions, because that's where it fell apart. Once they concluded that we cannot use the political process, we cannot use the judicial process, it is beyond our capacity, it's so corrupt, it cannot be used, right? And so it was the trust in government, the trust in Congress, in the Supreme Court. There's no recourse. We can't use the political system created in the Constitution because that's what's been corrupted, right? So even though these are not sexy issues, as I like to say, there are ways to address confidence in the institutions. One is to start with, and I'll share my opinion as a lawyer and as a Unitarian. I think the majority of the current Supreme Court is as corrupt as the one that decided the Dred Scott case.
Probably right.
I have lost confidence in that institution. Not all of them individually, but as an institution, I'm thinking, well, if the election in the next 3 weeks gets there, I don't trust that they're going to follow what I think of as the Constitution. And I think the immunity decision was the worst decision of the United States Supreme Court since Dred Scott. So like, I'm trying to teach my, it's the same week, but never mind. We can't give up on the court. We just can't give up because we don't want that violence. Okay, we can focus our energies on getting an enforceable code of ethics to help the court regain some of the credibility it's lost. That may be just as important as any other bill that Congress considers for taxes and social justice and everything else, restoring confidence in government itself. And there are concrete ways to do that. Another is to promote legislation to restore the rule of law to the presidency by limiting the effects of the court's immunity decision. Even though that's constitutional, there's some room there to put some additional checks and balances in there. Okay. While we're at it, Congress can improve the accountability and transparency of its own operations, particularly that travel fund where they're not required to turn in receipts. Yeah. You've been following that scandal? Okay. I'm not going to go into that scandal, but there's plenty to pick from, right? But you get the idea. And I said, they're not sexy, but they're not going to improve anybody's lives in the short run. But they're critical to the issue of political violence when political violence itself is rooted in the fear or the belief that the government and the Constitution and the political process are no longer available to solve problems. So that's why I think those are critical issues for us today. And they're bigger than anything happening in the next 3 weeks. Well, Martin Luther King, I think, had it right. He studied Thoreau. He took the best and left the rest, what we say about everything. And he still came down on the side of non-violent resistance. So I will give the last words to him today, because I suspect we're going to be eager to have a conversation about this. And don't forget, we're going to continue that conversation after the service. If I have to, I'm just anticipating having to cut you off. Last words to Martin Luther King. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. May it always be so, and blessed be.
Of your presentation. Thanks. This is just an aside, but my great-grandfather, Frederick Blessing, and his wife had a confectioner shop in Virginia. And Frederick Blessing was asked by the local sheriff, or whatever they were called, to go to the jail and to bring food to John Brown. And so he was with John Brown pretty much every day until he died, till the hanging. And to thank him, John Brown gifted him with a Bible. And he inscribed a little note of thanks to my great-grandfather. And that Bible, after my great-grandfather passed away, they became quite destitute. And my great-grandmother eventually sold the Bible. But it has now been retrieved and is located in Abraham Lincoln's museum in Illinois.
And the words of the aforementioned Theodore Parker, still true. Be ours a religion like sunshine that goes everywhere. Its temple all space, its shrine, the good heart, its creed, all truth, its ritual works of love, and its profession of faith, divine living. Thank you, everyone.
I just want to say thank you, Paul. We really needed that.
Thank you.